Hi, I'm Caio from Atelier RPG, and today I want to show you how to build a super easy Underdark or Alien piece of terrain for D&D and war games. I'll show you how I made these giant mushrooms, stalagmites, and a poisonous pool, all that with very cheap and easy to find materials. The stalagmites and mushrooms are modular, so you can realize the same elements and build different environments for your campaign. Wanna see how? Let's watch the video. Once more, I'll start my project with thin XPS foam. It's the easiest to find in Brazil. I cut two pieces of matching size in three different sizes. These are both because I want more elevation and because we need more space for the depth of the pool. Right after that, I draw the space of the pool with a regular pen. That will allow me to better guide my cuts and minimize errors. When in doubt, cut less than you think you need. You can always cut more afterwards. When you're done cutting, if there are any scraps, do not discard them. They might be very useful later. I sand all the borders of the pool. The paint will need texture to stick, since this part will not be covered in glue. I transfer the shape of the pool to the lower sheet of foam. That will allow me to use the back of a brush or a pen, or a ball shaper if you happen to have one, to press down on the shape and force some more depth without hurting the foam integrity. Once more, I sand the area of the pool for painting later. Here you can see the area we sanded is matte, while the outside is shiny. That's the foam outer layer, and paint doesn't like sticking to it. Now we apply glue to the bottom of the upper sheet of foam and glue them together, taking care to lock them in place correctly. Remember that scrap foam from the pool? Well, we're going to cut a piece of it and glue it on the corner to give more elevation and break the monotonous height of the piece. For the poisonous puddle, in the smaller terrain piece, I'll follow the same steps I used for the pool. Draw it with a pen, cut it, sand it, transfer the measurements to the lower sheet, sand the lower sheet, and glue them together. The last terrain piece won't have any major details on it, so I just sanded both faces of the foam sheets that would connect with glue and, well, glued them, but it made no difference overall, you can just skip the sanding. After all pieces had received glue, I put some weights on them, to make sure they didn't slide overnight. Once it was all glued, I cut all the borders of the terrain pieces into shape. There's no real rules for this part, so do as your heart desires. Just remember, as always, to try and cut at a 45-degree angle for it to better integrate onto your gaming table. Now we start the texturing process. I apply glue on all areas except on the borders of the pool and the puddle. After that, I very sparsely apply coarse sand. And the final element for this texture is baking soda. You can find big bags like this for very cheap, or use very fine-grained sand if you want. The fine texture of the baking soda will cover most of the texture, and the coarse sand will create some points of interest in it. I repeat the texturing process for all terrain pieces. It's always worth it to cover your workplace with something that makes cleanup easier. In my case, it's a piece of scrap plastic. While we wait for the texture to dry, let's start on the mushrooms. With an utility blade, I cut down several toothpicks to different heights. Now we temporarily stick them to a scrap piece of foam. Try and give them different angles when you do. With epoxy putty, I'll shape by hand the top part of the giant mushrooms. Mix it until it has no streaks, and then form a bottle cap on top of your fingertips. When you're satisfied with the shape and size, just drop it on top of a toothpick, aiming for the center of the cap. I recommend you make various sizes. We actually want some variance. Now we start the stalagmites. Cut a few pieces of aluminum foil and scrunch them down to a lance shape. Don't try and make it perfect. We want those creases and dents. Once the foil base is ready, we will again mix some epoxy putty and spread it like pizza dough. That will make it easier to fold it over the aluminum foil and cover it completely. Water will stop epoxy putty from sticking to you, so keep a water bowl nearby to make it easier on yourself. By the way, no need to cover the stalagmite's underside with epoxy, you can leave it as is. Now we're going to texture the epoxy putty. With the backside of 2 brushes, we'll give them the texture. Ideally, you should let the epoxy rest for at least 5 minutes after you stuck it to the foil before starting this step. If you start feeling like you're handling the stalagmite is rubbing off the texture you're making, set it down on the table and use the other brush, backside, to stabilize it while you finish texturing. If you have ball shapers at hand, they can be used to the same effect. I myself alternate between them and the brush's backsides. A few hours later, the epoxy putty has solidified, the glue has dried, and we are ready to start painting. But first, with a large soft brush, I dust off all the excess baking soda and coarse sand. This time, I won't seal the texture with diluted glue. It would obscure the fine texture of the baking soda. I'll just start with the craft black paint diluted 1:1 with water. You can just cover all of the terrain with it, no big deal. I recommend you use tapping motions with your brush, so we can minimize any damage to the texture. Once the black paint is dry, we'll mix a dark purple using dark blue and red craft paints. Water it down a little and you can brush it normally. Any and all texture should be well secured by now. With a little light blue and some deep blue, I mix a medium shade of blue and paint over the stalagmites. This will be their base tone. With white craft paint, I'll paint the mushrooms. I use undiluted paint straight from the pot and apply it over all of the mushrooms. This will be all the painting the mushrooms will get. Now I mixed a little light blue and pink to my deep purple and got a medium purple. This will be overbrushed over all of the texture. Don't go too hard on this overbrush, we still want a little of the deep purple to show on some recesses. With dark green, we're going over all of the inside of the pool and the puddle. Just be sure not to paint over your texture with it. With light blue, we will now make the main tone for the stalagmites. With very little paint on your brush, with the brush sideways, we will lightly overbrush this tone on the highest points of the texture we made. Be aware to not paint into the recesses, we still want the darker blue to show. This paint, even undiluted, has very bad covering, so I had to do 2 coats. With pure white, I very gently dry brush over the light blue. Remember to clean off most of the paint from your brush and to be sparse with your highlights. I mix up light blue and pink to get a lilac. I brush off most of the paint from the brush and dry brushed it all over. Remember, very little paint on the brush and try to focus all of the brush strokes in the same direction. Dry brush looks almost like magic, doesn't it? To see all the textures suddenly appear. Such a simple technique, but it brings so much to the paint job, it's unreal. To finish the texture paint job, we will use a white for a final dry brush. Mix in a little of the lilac and you have the perfect highlight tone. Be very light on this dry brush, or you end up taking away from the color saturation. With forest green, I'll paint all of the pool borders. Now to a very easy trick for a color gradation with acrylics. First, you paint over to where you want the colors to meet. Then you clean up your brush in water, leaving it a little damp, and spread it out further with the damp brush. Then you make the same with the inside color. Add paint, clean your brush, leave it damp, and then tap it to where you want the colors to meet. Clean up again, tap some more, and you should have a very nice transition. And finally, we fill up the pool. With styrofoam glue, we fill up the depth we created. I broke up the tip from my bottle to speed up the process. With a lot of caution, and with the help of a toothpick, I angled the terrain until the glue touched all the corners of the green paint, and I popped the bubbles with the toothpick. In this step, I used a very cool, very easy technique that ended up not showing at all in the end result. With Craft's neon paint and a toothpick, I made some nice swirls that ended up making no difference. Well, now for the final assembly. All elements in this project are modular. The mushrooms can be stuck whenever you want on the foam, the stalagmites can be placed anywhere they fit, and you can combine them at your will. And all that with only 3 terrain pieces. If you make more, you have even more possibilities. Well, when the glue dried, I ended up losing a lot of volume, and it developed some bubbles that I could not avoid, and the swirling effect practically vanished. But it still looks like a poisonous pool, with a clear layer on it to simulate liquid. Also, it dried completely solid for your minis to walk over. To me, this terrain looks perfect for a cave where goblins ambush the adventurers. They hide behind giant mushrooms, spring from behind stalagmites, and force the party to fall into a poison pool. As if the creatures were not already enough trouble, the party now has to fight their environment too. So, how was it? Easy, right? Building terrain for tabletop RPGs is so simple, and it's so rewarding to see a game table themed to your narration. I think it helps immersion out a lot. What about you? Have you ever tried building any terrain for D&D or wargames? Comment down below and tell me what you built or what you wanna build. Subscribe to never miss a video coming to you every week. Leave a like if you liked. And friends, good games.